All right, Richard is one of those rare creatures. He is, in fact, a cyber lawyer. So this will be an interesting juxtaposition, I think. Oh, come on up, Richard. And there we are. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Is my microphone working? Can you tell? It is? Okay. Okay, great. Good morning. My name is Rick Aldrich. And as he mentioned, I do practice law in the area of cyberspace. That's obviously not what I'm here to talk to you about today, but by way of background, if any of you have clicked through a DoD banner, I was part of the team that rewrote that after DoD lost a significant case that kind of undermined our ability to rely on that. And then I've moved on to a few different things. One of the things that I support Paul on also is the DoD cybersecurity policy chart. I don't know if many of you have seen that, but it's a PDF document that has about 200 policies on it aligned under the DoD IA strategy, and all the documents are hyperlinked. So it both tells you where to find what policy we have, and then how to get to it. And we do update that regularly, and it is posted at the CZAC site, so if you want to download that as well. But I did start getting involved in cybermetrics quite a long time ago with my involvement with the Computer Network Defense Assessment, which was an OSD survey that went out to all of the components of DoD, and they queried their compliance with certain policies within DoD. And then I rolled that up and presented it. And I will say that at one of those presentations, it was kind of a shocker for me, because it was to a 4-star general. I had all my standard deviations and means and everything else. And at the end of the presentation, he basically said, "So what?" And I suddenly realized that as obvious as it was to me how this all impacted him, I had not actually made those connections to make it clear to him how this impacted his mission and what he was supposed to do. So I thought I would basically conduct a little presentation on that. So one of the things about metrics, obviously, you can't manage what you can't measure. So we obviously want to measure those things that matter. But there's often a lot of problems we have in cybersecurity metrics. And I've noticed this from the position I said I work for Booz Allen Hamilton, supporting the Office of the Secretary of Defense, the DoD CIO specifically, and the DoD Deputy CIO for cybersecurity. And in that capacity, we see a lot of metrics coming up to us, and we're also presenting a lot of metrics. And we find increasingly that a lot of people just use whatever is available. So if we say, look, we need a metric on how you're doing with regard to X, Y, or Z, they scurry around and say, what do we have available? And they just grab whatever they have. And oftentimes that's because of the time frame that they're working in, et cetera, but we oftentimes find those metrics are not that reliable or not that helpful. I will say that even at the highest levels that becomes a problem, because frequently the federal government will say, DoD, we need a metric on something. And so we start scurrying too and say, well, geez, they need it really quickly. What do we already have in place? So that presents a problem, but it can be overcome. I will say that even on some other relatively high visibility projects in some other departments, they've collected what they had, and it was a good start. It showed what you could do through automated collection. But for instance, one of the things they collected was the date of the last antivirus update. Interesting, easy to collect, but does it really tell us how well we can defend ourselves against a sophisticated adversary? Probably not. So it's a start, and it's not a bad start, but we need to constantly start thinking, what are we collecting, and what can we collect in the future that would be more meaningful, or how can we mash up databases or data sets that we currently have to make the data more meaningful. We also find that a whole lot of times people present very technical metrics. So we saw one presentation that was going to the DoD CIO recently, produced by a subordinate organization, and when I looked at it, I noticed that they had things like the top vulnerability was vulnerability key, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Obviously, it was a different number, and I thought, the DoD CIO does not have all the vulnerability keys memorized, and he's not going to have a clue what that means, and so it's not going to mean anything to him. So we need to roll up those vulnerability keys into some higher level category and say, this is what this means to you, and this is why either you should take a particular action or why you should be concerned about what's going on. There's also a problem with the size and diversity of issues. Okay, so a lot of times what people want to do is they say, look, we have 5,000 different data sets here. Let's just pull them all together and present them all. So you have almost an overwhelming amount of metrics. And again, a senior leader is going to have difficulty processing that. So what you want to do is take those multitude of metrics, but roll them up, mash them up against each other, see how you can create more meaningful data so that you don't get that so what question thrown at you at the end. And then basically what we really want to do ultimately is tie it to that operational impact. Now, operational impact is one thing. It's not always the thing that you're going to want to brief. I know right now when we brief the DoD CIO, he's extremely concerned about budgetary issues because of the cuts in budgets and everything else. So although he wants to know the operational impact, in truth, if we presented the most effective solution right now, and that's all we presented is how effective it was, his question would be still, so what? Can I afford it, and is it the best expenditure of my funds? So if we haven't included that, we're still going to get that so what question. So you have to know what your briefee, the person you're briefing, really wants to know. Do they want to know how they can spend that next dollar most effectively? Do they want to know if the situation they've already invested in is the most effective, or what else do they want to know? So without knowing that, you really can't make that presentation, that metrics presentation, meaningful. Next slide. Oh, I am the next slide person. Sorry about that. Okay, so these are the 4 key issues. Know your audience, know your data, know the key types of metrics, or some people call certain types of metrics dimensions of metrics, and then keep the message clear. So the first one, know your audience. Metrics briefings, obviously, must vary by the audience. Even at my position, we're frequently briefing up to the Deputy Secretary of Defense or the DoD CIO. But a lot of times the questions we get from those things is, oh, I agree that's a problem. How do I fix it? Well, then what we have to do is we have to say, well, that's primarily in this component. So then we have to go back to that component and brief them. Look, the DoD CIO is concerned about a problem that's primarily in your component. How are you going to fix this? And then their question is going to be, okay, well, how do I fix it? What is the problem? So you have to shift from high-level metrics where you rolled everything up, and you have to go down to different metrics and pull them back apart. Okay, so you have to say, well, look, these are the problems, and this is how you could fix it. So it depends on whether you're briefing up or briefing down as to how you will orient your metrics to be most meaningful to that audience. Whoops. Whoa, this is on its own little thing here. Okay. And that was the end of my presentation. Okay. Orient the metrics to aid decision making. Okay, so again, these are the different types of authority. Oh, jeez. Okay, this is going to be a problem. Apparently, this was on some type of auto thing here. Maybe I just drop out of here. And I'm just going to put it in this mode. Whoops, sorry. Put it in this mode so that it doesn't keep automatically forwarding. Let's see here. Oops. Okay, so here we are. Know your audience. Okay, so so again, budgetary authority, if that's what their goal is, and increasingly if we're presenting to, for instance, CAPE, we're trying to get more money for a DoD cybersecurity project, then we need to be able to justify it on a budgetary basis. If someone's saying, look, I want to fix this problem, and their primary authority is in policy making, then we need to figure out how can they use their directive authority to make the change. Mid-level authority, obviously it's going to be a little bit of a mix there. System administrators, you need to tell them what exact vulnerability needs to be fixed and how they need to do it. So again, know your audience and anticipate what's important so that you can respond to those concerns during your briefing. Okay, know your data. Most data, I will say, in cybersecurity currently has a lot of problems with it, okay? And this is probably not that much different than many other fields, but a lot of the data is self-reported. So everyone knows the problems with self-reported data. There's going to be a tendency to make yourself look a little bit better or to make yourself look compliant, etc. So how do you overcome this? Well, in some cases, you can word the way you ask it a little bit differently. So for instance, one time when we were doing a compliance check, we said, look, rate your compliance in each of these areas, and those with the lowest compliance level would be considered for additional funding to help bring them up so that we don't have a weak overall defense. So now they have two competing goals. They want to show they're compliant, but they also want to get that money to help them do better. So now they might be actually a little bit more honest in how they respond. And we found that to be the case. There are some people who, if you ask them straight up, are you compliant? Yes, yes, yes. Because the reg says they have to be, so why are they going to admit they aren't? Even if they aren't, they're going to go back and fix themselves really quickly. But if you say, look, there may be money in this, if you're having difficulty because of resources and making yourselves compliant, then they're going to be a little bit different in how they respond. So that's self-reported data. And then automated data. A lot of people think, oh, automated data is the nirvana. Once you have automated data, it's there. I mean, because there's no subjectivity to it. It's automatically being collected across the components. But I will say that we've had a lot of problems even with automated data. So for instance, you can have people who game automated data. You know, we have a system that will automatically roll up host-based data across the department. Well, if someone knows when that roll-up's going to occur, they can remove systems, and the roll-up occurs without them being counted. Okay? So now you have automated data. It's not subjective, but the fact is, if people know how to game it, they can pull their systems off. They don't get counted and put it back on. Okay? The other thing is, some people forget that even when you have automated solutions, they generally don't encompass everything. So DoD's host-based security solution, which is a very good product, spread very widely across the DoD, still doesn't cover every asset. Okay? And those assets it does cover, sometimes they don't have all the modules correctly loaded. Or if they have the modules, sometimes they don't have them properly configured. So when we get the data that rolls up from there, we get kind of interesting results. So even with our automated data sources, we run trending analyses. And we found that you know, DoD's asset count can vary quite a bit. And that's because of these roll-up problems. You know, maybe one of the servers that rolls up a lot of subordinate components is offline or has a problem, so all of a sudden all those don't get counted. So regardless of your source, whether it's self-reported, which has built-in problems, but you can overcome them to some extent. Same with automated data. Don't consider it to be automatically irrefutable, because there are problems with that as well. Okay, let me just see if I can. Okay, let's see, examples of limitations. Okay, we did kind of allude to this already. The fact of gaming is kind of a big problem too. Whenever you develop a metric, make sure you think through all the different ways people might be able to game it, because they will. I mean, it's unfortunate, but people will do it. So if you ask certain questions in certain ways, they'll figure out how it can be interpreted different ways to make themselves still look the best or whatever else. Or they'll do it in a certain way that creates the best opportunity for them to either avoid culpability or to seek some advantage some other way. Some people are very blatant about it. We actually had one organization where we said the top, we did a big survey, and we said the top organizations will be asked to share their lessons learned so that all of DoD can benefit from that. And the bottom organizations will be required to submit POAMs, basically, to explain how they're going to do better. And I had one large component submit, and they called me and they said, are we in the top or the bottom? And I said, why? And they said, my boss said he wants to be in the middle because we don't want to have to do the work on either end. So if we aren't, just change my answers to make them to the middle. No! I mean, talking about bold gaming, you know, I was kind of surprised at that. But people will game it, so you just have to be careful. Also, we're generally collecting metrics to drive behavior. So you want to be able to drive the right behavior. So in some cases, you know, you may want a certain thing to be done. For instance, you know, let's suppose you wanted everyone to patch a particular vulnerability. Well, that's a good metric. And let's suppose your goal is 100%. Well, unfortunately, sometimes you might get to this 95% level, and the 5% that you don't have are isolated systems in far out locations that may not have that much impact on the mission. So the question is, do you really want to pay the now relatively high level of dollars to fix those last few, or do you consider the goal to have been reached, and going beyond that will actually not be beneficial anymore? You've kind of reached the point of best return. So you just have to think those things through too. The other thing is, I think in a lot of cases, if you're doing self-assessments or self-reported data, if you at least say these answers will be subject to no notice inspection, people will tend to answer more frankly as well, and that can be helpful too. And to some extent, you've got to conduct a few notice inspections to make sure that people realize it's not an idle threat. And that can be a little tricky, but I think it's helpful. And it can actually dramatically improve the value of your data. And then I think the other thing that I really need to make a point of here is that correlation does not equal causation. So a lot of times you'll have two sets of data and you say, well, geez, whenever this goes up, this gets better. So therefore, this going up must cause that to get better. And that's not always the case, of course. There may be some correlation, but it does not mean causation. And so when you present the metrics, make sure you make that point clear, because otherwise they'll say, oh, well, geez, let's just do a lot more of that and we're fixed. And that may not be the case. You have to do a lot more work to figure out if there's the actual causation, and that's not always easy to prove. Another point I think is important to make is that cybersecurity metrics value, I believe, is more so over time rather than a point in time. So you can take a snapshot and you can look really good during that snapshot, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're secure or that you're great or anything else. What I think is more helpful is if you take a snapshot over relatively, some type of period of time, and if you are showing improvement over that time, that can actually be more helpful. Because at any one time, it may be possible for you to be very compliant. But if you don't have good, mature processes in place, you're likely to fall out of compliance very quickly. So that snapshot in time may not be that helpful. But if you can show trending, that shows that a more mature program that may prove something worthwhile there. I think we also have to realize that it is probably too difficult to have all machines always fully patched, fully sticked, etc. So the point I made earlier is there may be points of no return. It's not always possible to make those clear, because a lot of times everyone wants everything patched. And certainly, if you don't have things patched, if that system is connected to the whole network, there are always ways they can get in through the back doors. So you do have to be careful with that, but you do have to at least be cognizant of that. And then I think also it's very helpful to show the significance, or the so what question, to show how you compare against industry, your peers, or certain benchmarks. Okay? Data in the abstract is not as helpful. So a lot of times you say, like if someone came to you and said your car tires have 1 millimeter of wear, your brakes have 1 millimeter of wear, and something else, your fluid is 1 ounce short. Your question, unless you're really familiar with cars, might be, so what? What does that mean? Am I good? Can I keep driving? Should I immediately pull off to the side of the road, or what? And I think we need to do that here too. How are we doing against our peers? How are we doing against benchmarks? How are we doing against industry? That helps us better understand how we're doing overall. Okay? There's a few different types of metrics. Obviously, you can divide up metrics in many ways. NIST 800-55 divides them into implementation, effectiveness, efficiency, and impact. There's also quantitative versus qualitative metrics. I think both have value. Some people say, oh no, we only want quantitative metrics. I think that's because those tend to be more automated and less subjective. But I think in some cases there are very important things you need to know that you cannot obtain quantitatively. So getting the qualitative feedback on those is good. There's strategic and tactical metrics, etc. So I'm not going to really get into that, but I want to discuss 4 different dimensions of metrics. Some people call them dimensions: time, risk, return on investment, and effectiveness. And each of those has its value. So for instance, this year Microsoft put Microsoft Windows XP into an end-of-life situation in April of this year. And so leading up to that, there was basically a time metric that we needed to collect. Is DoD going to be able to migrate off XP by the end-of-life date? Okay? So there you really do need to know, how are we doing? What's our trend? Are we going to be able to make it to the goal line in time? And that becomes a very important thing. Now again, that may not be enough, because the commander or the person you're presenting to may still ask, so what? I mean, does XP stop working on that date? No, of course it doesn't. But it stops being capable of being patched, although in the end Microsoft kind of relented, and they are, for a fairly hefty fee, still patching some of these systems. But even if they're patching them, you have to say, okay, but what about third-party vendors? Are they still supporting the programs that work with XP? What about shifting to different encryption schemes? Will Windows XP support those more secure encryption schemes? So even if the end of life doesn't mean total lack of support, it may mean lack of support in a bunch of other areas that may make it difficult, and you need to point those out. IABA compliance, right, the same thing, where we generally tend to say, okay, you have to have this done within 30 days, and that becomes a time-oriented goal. Most recently, though, I think really what commanders seem to want are these risk-oriented metrics. Are we adequately responding to the threat, vulnerability, and potential impact? And I will say, I think some people misrepresent risk metrics. I've seen some people make very nice presentations and say, we reduced our risk by 90% by implementing this, but all they really showed was the vulnerability decrease, okay? Vulnerability is only one factor. They aren't incorporating threat, they aren't incorporating impact, so really to say they've reduced it by 90%, the risk is not really accurate. So I think if you really want a meaningful risk metric, you've got to include all of those: threat, vulnerability, impact. Threat generally tends to be classified, so as soon as you start including that, you've now elevated your briefing to at least a secret level or higher, which some people don't like. It's also sometimes a little bit more difficult to get specific threat data about situations, so that may be more difficult. Vulnerability tends to be the easiest one to measure. Potential impact, it can be depending on how well you know your systems and how good your data is, but that's another one that can be a little bit tricky. Return on investment, as I said, in these tight financial times, these tend to be the most important metrics right now, and a lot of times they'll ask, okay, look, we're short on money, but we may be able to get, X millions more. If we do, where should we spend it? Where's the best investment that we can make? Or, even worse, they say, look, we're going to have to take a cut. Where can I take the cut with the least impact on my overall risk? And so you have to go both ways. And then effectiveness, I think sometimes people forget about this. You get a great program, you get some money, you fund it, and you implement it, but then you forget to still measure it. You forget to measure what's going on. I know recently the DoD CIO said, okay, I put a ton of money into HBSS, what did I get from it? Well, unfortunately, because we could ask the question at that point, it was kind of difficult, because what we really need to do is take some baseline measurements before HBSS, the host-based security system, got rolled out, and then kind of realize how it was being rolled out and take periodic measurements, so at the end you could say meaningfully, this is how much we've improved. Now in DoD or in any other complex organization, it's still going to be difficult, because DoD, at the same time that it was implementing HBSS, was implementing about 10 other cybersecurity solutions. So how are you going to be able to disentangle all that and pull that thread through and tell how much HBSS actually contributed to that? It's going to be difficult. But you want to know about those things beforehand. As soon as you're going to implement a new solution, start doing those baseline measurements so that you will at least have a fighting chance of making an effectiveness measure later on. Keep the message clear. I mean, some of the people, the senior leaders that we briefed to, are very concerned. One says, I never want to see saturated colors. One says, I never want to see 3D bar graphs, okay? And partly because they kind of skew the data or they distract from the data. So they want to have it very, very clear. Try not to be too wordy. If you can tell the story in a visualization or graphic, oftentimes that's far better. And then I gave just some examples. This is currently a very popular type where the worst things are in that upper right quadrant, okay? So you're going mission impact against likelihood, and then everything that's bad should be up in that right corner. That's easy for commanders to understand. It mimics what they've done in other fields, so if they see that, they're like, yeah, okay, I know that's bad, and I can kind of, ignore this for now. This might be coming along, but that I really need to address right away. If you're doing a trend line, people generally think if it's going up, that must be good. So try to make your charts match that. Obviously, there's going to be some situations where you're not going to be able to do that. Maybe you want to talk about the decrease in vulnerabilities. If you do, then your line's going to be going down, but you just need to clearly make the point that going down in this case is good, okay? Too often, people come up with complex metrics that they don't know whether it's good to go up or good to go down. So just make it very clear so that intuitively, the person who's receiving the briefing will know what's going on there. Radar charts can be a little bit more complex. Some people love them, some people hate them. I mean, in theory, if you have all your lines around the outside, that should mean very good. Wherever they're coming in, that's some problem area. And this can present a lot of data. So in this particular one, I think I have like 10 different data points with all sorts of data points in the middle. It tells you immediately, where do I need to concentrate most? It looks like software assessment or asset management. This is totally fictitious data, just so you know. That would be the problem. I need to address that because that's where it's closest to the middle, although this one's a problem too, incident detection. Other things, maybe not quite as bad. So it kind of gives you a quick overview, but some people do find it a little confusing. And I ran through a lot of things right there, but if you do have any questions at this point, I'll take those. Yes?
You mentioned baseline metrics. What type of metrics are you referring to?
Well, it can vary, I think. So let's suppose that you are implementing a solution that was supposed to resolve problem X. But I think what you need to do for your baseline is figure out what's the level of X that we're experiencing now, so that once we implement this, we can figure out, did that actually reduce the incidence of level, X? So the baseline measurement may vary based on what you're actually trying to measure. Ideally what some people would like to do is they'd like to take a baseline measurement of a broad swath of things, so that later they can go back and they can say, well, we did 4 different things this time, but this particular aspect should have been impacted by this. Did it in fact cause it to go down? So a baseline measurement would be anything you take at a certain point in time to establish that ground truth for where you are at that point. And then you can measure against that later in time.
Question in
Yeah.
the back.
Sure.
You mentioned about the threats and stuff like that. That's
Yes.
a constantly changing environment, and if you take a baseline, how's that, that's going to be changing too, so
And that's one of the-
staying constant,
Yeah.
or even increasing your metric of success might be further away as the threat gets greater.
Yeah, and that's one of the problems we have in cybersecurity, especially competing in return on investment. If you had a constant threat, it'd be a lot easier. And what we have occasionally are these problems where we say, look, if you invest X millions of dollars in this situation, this will dramatically improve our security posture. And you do that, and then it turns out you have more attacks against you, and they're like, what happened? And then you have to kind of basically see if you can show, if we had not implemented the solution, it would have gone up like this. And in fact, it only went up like this. So yes, the threat's getting more sophisticated, it's getting stronger, it's getting more omnipresent. And so the question is, how do you measure that against this return on investment? And you get into that tricky situation where you have to try to prove that we'd have been even worse off if we didn't do this, even though we didn't lower it like we thought we would. The fact is that, and it's even worse to some extent. It's kind of like, with Heartbleed and shell shock, bash bug. These are like quick things that take a lot of resources out that we oftentimes didn't anticipate. And so people will say, well, wait a minute, we put all these millions of dollars in, and it still costs us millions of dollars to respond to these individual one-offs. But it's not much different from healthcare. If you said, look, we want to get everyone immunized against the flu virus, and then all of a sudden something comes along like Ebola, and you're like, what the heck, you said the flu virus would help us. Well, it did. It controlled the flu. But it didn't control this new virus that came out that we didn't anticipate, and we still had to spend a whole lot of money on. But if we hadn't at least controlled for flu, you'd have to deal with both of them at the same time. Okay, so you're in that kind of situation. Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much.